Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Change with Ted Williams. Remember, change starts with you. I am so honored and so grateful to have a good friend of mine here who is going to join us and help us to talk about what on earth is going on in this political process. There's just so much. This is Dr. Connie Mixon, and she's from Elmhurst College. She's a professor of political science, urban studies, director of the urban studies program there. Connie, there is always so much. With this administration, I just feel like you can't take a day off, right? Like it's something every single day, every week. So the RNC is going on,
Yep.
and I don't even know where to start, to be honest with you, in this conversation. But what I will say is that there is such a marked difference between what happened last week in the DNC and what happened this week with the RNC. Before we get into any details, what were your general impressions of what you've seen so far?
Well, particularly the first night of the RNC, it offered plenty of red meat for Trump's base, but it really did little to convince undecided voters. They continued to promote mis- and disinformation that was designed to convince Americans that they would face this dystopian future under a Biden-Harris administration. And the speakers continued to air really familiar grievances. And unfortunately, they continued to echo a lot of President Trump's dog whistles. And to me, it seemed as if they were just, they had just picked up the 1968 Nixon playbook of fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this very often with the Republican Party. Now it's interesting, Connie, and I'll go ahead and lay this out as we've talked about before. Ideologically, I'm not going to say I'm opposed to everything that they're talking about, right? I mean, there are some sensible pieces there that that if we were in a kind of sane and sober time, we could kind of have some conversations, a little differences here about this issue, a little differences here about that issue, same goals, different approaches. But this Republican Party that we're dealing with now is there's no sort of common middle ground to discuss issues sensibly and that sort of thing. Can you give us a little background as a political scientist? How did we get here in the Republican and the Democratic Party?
It's interesting that you refer to it as the Republican Party. I view it much more as the party of Trump. What is absolutely disturbing to me, and this goes to the point that you just made about talking about policy issues, and we could at least 10, 15 years ago agree there was poverty. The Democratic Party might have a different policy prescription for that than the Republican Party might have, but you at least agreed on that. This party of Trump couldn't even put together a party platform. That is absolutely disturbing to me. All they did was reaffirm their blind loyalty to one man, to Trump, and this concerns me, and I think Democrats were absolutely right the week before when they issued really stark warnings about our democracy. A party that can't even put together a platform and just presents blind loyalty to one man is leading us down a path towards even more nationalism and authoritarianism.
Do you see the party recovering after Trump? So let's say Trump is not reelected, right? Okay. Let's say Trump is not reelected. How does the party come back after this?
Yeah. There are voices. So, for example, there is an alternative Republican Party convention that's being held right now. There's the Lincoln Project. It's a question. If he loses, was he just a 4-year blimp, in history, or is it, our elected leaders are reflections of us, and
Right.
what is that saying about us? I do think that the Republican Party is at an inflection moment, and has to figure out where they're going to go.
You know, it's interesting you say that because I would hope that he would be an aberration, right? I would hope that we look back in history and we go, the Republican Party stood for this, and then there was Trump, right? And then years later, they went back to sort of standing for certain things. But I'm not convinced from history that that's how this game works. In fact, and you're a political scientist and a historian, presidential candidates and leadership, they change parties, and parties follow them, right? As you look at what Nixon was able to do with the Southern Strategy. If you look at really Reagan and his inroads in the evangelical community and really kind of taking that from the Jimmy Carters of the world. If you look at, you can go all throughout history, look at what FDR did and how FDR was critical in moving poor people, progressive people, people of color into the Democratic Party and sort of keeping them there for a long time. So for me, Connie, I don't know that I'm as hopeful that Trump is an aberration and that we're going to go back to some sense of normalcy right after this. What do you think about those historic examples?
No, I think you're right. But I also think that Trump is creating a party realignment that I hope is for the better. One of the major shifts that we saw was Nixon's Southern strategy, right? Through his dog whistles, his playbook of fear, he was able to bring Southern Democrats into, leave the Democratic Party, go to the Republican Party. And he also was able to play to suburban voters. So suburban voters were a relatively new demographic at that time, right? So we had the mass expansion of suburbs after World War II, cut all kinds of funding for cities. I could go on talking about that forever. But there was a major realignment in the demographics of the Republican Party. What we're seeing now with Trump is those suburban voters, particularly suburban women, are leaving the Republican Party in mass. So in 2018, suburban women voted Democrat by 19% over what they had in 2016. So I think that is a significant demographic shift that the Republican Party is bleeding women. And, Trump's response to this is to tweet out, to talk, to stoke fear amongst suburban housewives. Come on. We are in 2020.
Right. But that has been his MO from the beginning, Connie. And, if you look at the launching of his campaign, I've been studying politics my whole life. I've never seen anything like it. Time after time, he would insult, whether it be war veterans, Latinos, he would insult African Americans, women, you name it.
Those with disabilities. Yeah.
Yes, people with disabilities. And every time it happened, I said, well, surely, this is the thing, right? That's going to get sane and sensible people to stop supporting this guy. And it has not happened. And so, but you were saying that suburban women are leaving and they're probably not coming back, unless. Yeah. So, well,
I don't think they're coming back. And I think this is part of the larger Republican strategy, right? Just demographics alone should lead to Democrats winning most elections, particularly on a national level, even with the Electoral College. But the Republicans' really only hope is to squash voter turnout. That's why we see so much in terms of voter suppression. We see the post office. We see them stoking fears about the legitimacy of this election that's coming up. They know if Democrats turn out, they lose. So they're doing everything in their power to spread disinformation and question the legitimacy of this election just because the numbers aren't there. And the fact that they are, politics is about addition, not subtraction.
Absolutely.
And last week, we saw Democrats, much to the dismay of more progressive liberals, move to the center with lots of the speeches, with Joe Biden trying to peel off those 2016 Trump voters. What I've seen so far in the RNC is that they're not trying to expand their tent at all. They're just hoping to keep their tent together.
Yeah,
Why
absolutely.
else would they keep, repeating, the same lies and the same rhetoric that fires up their base? They're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
doing anything to add to their party.
Yeah, I want to talk about Joe Biden in a second. I want to talk about, his double-digit lead that I've seen in a number of polls, which, I mean, is hopeful and promising, and yet, Hillary had leads as well, and that sort of thing. But before I do that, we're gonna get in that in 1 second. I want to talk about the tone of the convention, right? Because in politics, perception is reality. So, not everyone is a political science professor, right? Not everyone's thinking about these issues and reading the polls and that sort of thing. Many people are just kind of looking at this. Like I watched the convention with my kids and my wife, right? And my kids are looking at things, and they sit and it's interesting because I think children are brilliant, right? And I think that without a lot of direction, children are very good gauges and judges of character and kind of what's going on. And I remember them sitting watching, and they were just sort of amazed at the tone, right, of the convention, particularly the first night, right? The first night was just sort of that I think they tried to tone it down a little bit this last night here with Melania's speech and that sort of thing. I was on the radio this morning, and the host asked me, he goes, "Well, aren't you encouraged that Melania did not come out and bash everybody?" I said, "Yeah, well, she didn't have to because the previous 15 speakers had already done it, right? So it's not like she gets a pat on the back for that." But this tonal issue, right, and this genning up, if you will, of division and genning up of racial hatred and those sorts of things, Connie, I can tell you that that is what is most problematic to me and what breaks my heart. Again, as I said before, we can have differences in opinion and how we approach things, but what did you think about the tone of the convention overall? And then we're going to talk about Joe Biden in a second.
Yeah. Lots of screaming, lots
Mm-hmm.
of the same rhetoric. This picture, and it's in contrast. And I'm jumping ahead, I know, but last week Democrats, they were serious, they were somber. This week it's more fear based. More fear based. They were the ones who came out. Trump was tweeting about how terrible and bleak the Democrats were, and I'm not seeing any positivity coming out of this Republican convention thus far. Yeah, we had Melania last night who, sort of tempered things, but part of the reason for putting families is speaking at conventions is to humanize the candidate. And we didn't see much humanization of Trump whatsoever. And in fact, in Melania, what's interesting is Melania's speech was not vetted by the White House.
Oh, she wasn't.
You remember 2016, there were plagiarism issues.
Yeah, there were, yeah.
By her speechwriters who were from the administration. And so I think in some ways she was trying to say some of the things that her husband wouldn't say. She was the first one, by the way, to acknowledge any of the death and suffering from COVID at the convention. She was the only speaker that even acknowledged it. She also started to hint a little bit at some of the racial unrest that we're experiencing. She didn't go full in, but she was the first one to, say something. It's not enough. It's by no means enough.
No, I saw a few folks kind of hint at it. Tim Scott, the Attorney General from Kentucky, I forget his name, the African American gentleman, also Nikki Haley. But what every one of them did,
racism doesn't exist.
And she said, and Connie, she said that she had a tough time growing up as a brown woman. And I'm just like, what on earth are you talking about, Nikki Haley? But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. It baffles me. But what I did see, and this is the challenge that I found, right? Because my background. I mean, I've delved in conservative thought and that sort of thing, particularly because I'm very concerned with the problems in urban communities and really thinking, how do we deal with this, right? Is it small business? Is it is it low taxes? Is it giving kids school choice? Those sorts of things. Are those ways to kind of address some of this stuff, right? And so I delved into that for a long time. But it's interesting because first of all, obviously, even if you look at their ideology in terms of public policy solutions and outcomes, that doesn't really work very well for marginalized people, number one. But number two, when I looked at this issue of these folks that they paraded up there who were of color, what I came away with this, I came away with this thought, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this or whatever you think. I just really like to hear you. I felt like people like Tim Scott were saying, literally, at least we're not in slavery anymore. Like literally, I felt that they were saying, hey, I made it, tokenism, so racism does not exist. And as you and I have talked and studied and researched and written about, because one person makes it, or two people make it, or five people make it, does not mean that there are not institutional forces that are oppressing the masses of people and that are denying people access to equal health care and equal education and equal public safety. And those things don't exist. And so what I'm saying is that the simplicity of their arguments is mind-boggling. Have you read a book? Have you thought about these things beyond the fact that you have your little story of making it to where you are? Good for you, kudos. But tokenism does not negate institutional racism.
It doesn't. We heard from Democrats discussions about systemic racism and the impact that it's having today. We're not hearing that from Republicans. I think you're absolutely right. You know, they paraded folks who talked about how they made it and the opportunities that they've had, but they failed to acknowledge too many that are left behind in impoverished, particularly urban neighborhoods that lack access to basic things like, I don't know, water, healthy food, transportation, schools, healthcare. We could take, and I've said this before to you and in other venues, the redlining, if we're talking about systemic racism, the redlining that occurred in the cities through the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, 1940s, we can take those same maps and we can lay over them and see the same patterns that still exist today in terms of segregation. And I did a project this summer, an independent project, research with student, in which we mapped COVID cases and environmental injustice, and we saw those same patterns that still exist today in Chicago and Milwaukee. And I'm sure we find the same thing, whether we're looking at Philadelphia, Cleveland, Detroit, we'll still see those same patterns.
Right. So, you know, the thing that, you know, because we both teach political science, I think a lot about these questions of like federalism and things like that. Skipping over to Joe Biden for a second, you know, one of the things that I was very encouraged, and let me say this, Connie, I am no like rah-rah Joe Biden fan, okay? I mean, Joe Biden has put his foot in his mouth more times than I would care to, you know, to see. It is always, you know, him saying something that I just almost sometimes like, Joe, please just stay in the basement, Joe. Please don't say anything else, Joe. Just stay in the basement until the election comes. We're going to support you. Just please be quiet, okay? Just be quiet. And so, you know, so just for clarification, right? But in politics, you know, and there are no permanent friends nor permanent enemies, only permanent interest. And so we're looking at not sort of who Joe Biden is necessarily all the way around, although I think he has got infinitely more character than the guy we have in the White House now. But we're looking at policies. And so when I look at where he is, and he's in the lead right now, do you think that, particularly in swing states, that Joe Biden is polling well enough and is speaking to the issues that disaffected white blue-collar workers are thinking about, suburban voters? What do you see about that? Do you think that he has what it takes to turn some of those swing states?
I think of all the options that we were presented in the Democratic primary, I think he's probably got the best shot.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. He can appeal as the average Joe.
Yeah.
From Scranton.
Literally.
You know, he can, of all the candidates, he has the best shot. You know, old white man, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I heard something, I can't remember who said it, but somebody said it. It's not me, but somebody said it's going to take an old white man to beat an old white man.
You know, and it's probably the truth, Connie. That's the truth. You know, although you know I have my favorites in there. You know, I liked a couple other folks. I like there was an older white woman I liked named Elizabeth Warren, who I thought was pretty cool. There was a younger white guy named Beto that I liked. There was an Asian guy that I liked named Andrew Yang, and I even like Cory Booker as well. Although I have got a lot of, I've been around Cory Booker a lot, so I've got some things that I like and not crazy about. But there's a lot of folks there, right? So you really think that he has the best shot of really getting those swing states?
I do. He wasn't necessarily my first choice either. But of all the candidates, I think we've got the best option that could have come out of the Democratic primary process. It has the best chance of pulling voters from Trump. As you talked about, rural, whites, suburban.
Yeah.
He doesn't, and it's hard to frame him, like last night, all the speeches talked about the radical left. Like
the radical left. But
he's not the radical left.
He's not. But so this is why I know he's effective, because they cannot pin that stuff on him. He's not Bernie, right? What they're doing is they're going Joe Biden and the radical left, who's going to take over if he gets elected. That's what they're saying. They're not saying Joe Biden's radical left because nobody's going to believe it. But they're saying their only argument now is like, when you put Joe in, they got all the radical left people coming with him. I don't think I think that's going to sell here. You know what I mean? But it is what it is. But what I like about what Joe Biden said, and back to this federalism question, is that, he really made a statement on this recently, even about the COVID crisis, which I'm going to talk about for a second. And he says, listen, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply create a national mandatory mask policy, right? Like using the tools of the federal government to create standards, universal standards across localities and things like that. That alone, Connie, is light years ahead of what the conservative ideology does. We cannot live in an every man for himself time when we're facing the largest global pandemic in 100 years. So what do you think about this issue of federalism, Joe Biden mandating things? Because Trump is always talking about, I shut stuff down. You didn't shut anything down, Trump. You didn't shut anything down. I shut it down. You didn't shut anything down. What do you think about this approach, this federalism in the COVID crisis, and then in other issues as well?
I mean, that's been the problem, is we've not had any national leadership whatsoever. And we're facing a global pandemic. And in times of crisis like this is exactly what the national government is for. Yeah. Madison wrote in one of the Federalist Papers, right, that in times of war and crisis, it is important for the national government to step in. And the state governments are better in peace and prosperity, right? Yes. So our founders knew this, that it was absolutely necessary for national leadership. And the fact people have died because of the lack of national leadership and the failures of our national government.
Yeah, absolutely. And that to me, makes this show not funny, right? It makes this Republican National Convention, the parading of various people, it makes it not funny, because as you guys are out not talking about the crisis, talking about how well he's doing with the crisis, thousands of people are dying, right? We're at 170,000 now, is it? 170,000?
No, we're almost up to 180,000, 179 something as of yesterday.
Right. Which is unconscionable, and I don't understand how anyone, Connie, in their right mind can look at that and go, there's nothing that we could have done. We have, I think, what is it? It's 12 times the rate of the Canadians and the British in terms per capita in terms of the deaths and also the cases and infections in this country. And so
more than any other nation.
Yes, this is awful. So when I look at this idea of really, I hate to say this, but conservatism, right? I say that, there's an old phrase that says there are no atheists in foxholes. There are no libertarians in times of crisis, right? You know what I mean? We need the federal government. And to have a president in the White House sitting on that level of power and authority and to not use it. And by the way, what really bothers me is I see him attempting to use it now. Right. So what you see this desire to push a moratorium on student loans and a moratorium on evictions and things like that. We're 5 months into this thing, and now you want to do this? Now you want to give us a second stimulus? So anyway, go ahead. I'll let you talk about
it. I mean, he's supposed to be the great negotiator, right? And we still haven't expanded unemployment benefits that were in place, the extra $600 that folks were getting. Those expired at the end of July. And notably, he refused to attend any of the meetings between Republicans and Democrats in Congress, right? Where is the great negotiator? Not part of this at all. Yeah. It's absolutely disgraceful. Yeah. And our national government has to step in. Yeah. So I do appreciate the fact. And what are the statistics? That if everybody wore a mask, like, we would save thousands and thousands of lives, and we would come out within a matter of 6 weeks. Absolutely. Why can't we just do that?
Unbelievable. Because we have this notion, this idea. We're going to close out in a couple minutes here, but we have this idea in America that any kind of federal policy, regulation is impacting our freedom, right? And so there's this proud, this really worship, if you will, of freedom in this country. But it's so ironic because FDR, who obviously was probably the most popular president we've had, with the exception of maybe George Washington, because FDR was died his 4th term, right? And so FDR was reelected before we had limits on the presidency. Washington probably would have been reelected if he had chosen to, but he used the federal government more than any president in history.
Yeah.
And you see how people responded to him. What does that tell you? Duh. Like, people may say that they want freedom and they want, the government to do anything. But I tell you, when people are dying and when people are in need, there's no entity in this nation that has the power to mobilize the way the federal government does. And it's irresponsible and immoral not to mobilize it. Anyway, any closing thoughts, Dr. Connie Mixon? What do you want to say?
Oh, I agree with everything you've had to say. FDR, started this reign of Democrats, controlling national government for how many decades going up till Nixon. And yeah, it's a model. Instead, what we have is a president who wants to follow the model of Richard Nixon. It doesn't make any sense in a time of crisis. One of the things that struck me last night, and I'm still working this out, and I'm not a psychologist, but it was one of the things that, Trump seems to always project negativity. It's a regular strategy that he uses and his surrogates use. So last night, for example, we had a speaker that accused Joe Biden of nepotism. Then we get Tiffany Trump that comes up and is talking about, how Democrats only get their news from one source and it's groupthink or something. But then Trump himself, right? Like, he criticized Mitt Romney for not releasing his taxes. He's criticized Obama for playing too much golf. It seems as he's got this projection strategy in which he presents his own wrongdoing onto others. But yet it's enough to muddy the waters and to plant seeds of doubt, and it destabilizes their opponent. And it spreads more and more disinformation. And Ted, we've talked about this. The most important thing for our democracy to succeed is to have an educated citizenry. Our citizens have to pay attention. They have to be engaged, and they have to realize that they're getting wrong information.
That is so critical, and that is why we do the work that we do, because knowledge is power. Nelson Mandela called education the greatest tool we have to change the world. We're going to wrap up here, but I see we got a couple folks in the comment section who are saying a few things, which I just want to acknowledge before we go. Some folks have said that our elected leaders are a reflection of us, which you agree with. They talk about tokenism, institutional racism. And then one of our good friends, former producer on the Professor show, Ricardo, has hopped in there. And Ricardo's a friend of ours who probably disagrees with most of what we're saying here. But that's okay. We love Ricardo. And but Ricardo, I just want to hit one thing that he says here about this double speech here, that if President Trump tries to use his powers, we call him a dictator. But if he doesn't, then we call him apathetic or whatever. And I have a response to that, but I'd love to let you have a response to that if you like for a second. I can go first. Sure. So my response to that, and this is, we're closing out here, is that Unfortunately, our current president has literally about, and I'm going to give you a perfect quick example. The president of the Philippines, President Duterte in the Philippines, has notoriously usurped the rule of law, promoted extrajudicial killings, has worked on his war on drugs by literally taking away people's civil rights. And President Trump's response to him was, wow, like, can we do that here also? So what I'm saying is that I have nothing as a person who is left leaning in this current season. I have nothing against our president. And in fact, I would argue that, particularly as a minority, that President Trump, had he come out and been halfway sensible, halfway inclusive, halfway reasonable, his celebrity popularity would have made him extremely popular, even in communities like mine. The problem is, the reason why he gets accused of being a dictator, the reason why he gets accused of violating people's rights, is because he's done it over and over again, and he's praised all the people that do it. So it's on one hand, yes, I would love for him to use his authority, but when you use that authority and you're praising dictators at the same time, of course people are going to put two and two together. And so using your authority, by the way, to save lives, right, in the localities is a good thing. And one thing I will say, and I'll close out by saying this for me, and I don't want to be overly partisan on this, but I have to say this. I do believe that people on the left in this season are much more likely to give a point here and there on the right, to say maybe they did something right, maybe they did something correct, maybe, just maybe, look at Trump is doing this. We don't like him in this area, but man, he did this right. I don't know that I've ever heard people on the right say anything positive about President Obama, say anything positive about Hillary Clinton, say anything positive about Bernie Sanders. And I think that I don't want to create a false equivalency here. I am interested in policy and what works. And if he gets it right, he gets it right. But in this area, I don't think he is. But I'll let you go ahead and say what you got to say on that.
No, I think you're right. We're just so polarized, right? Like we have this blind loyalty to our team, and we can't seem to come together to form any sort of compromise. But I believe that President Trump is deepening those divides, and he feeds off of creating more polarization and more divides. And for part of what Ricardo had said a moment ago, right? He refused to take any national action to shut us down. But then when he started to worry about the economy instead of people's lives, there was a way to do both. But instead, he said he couldn't do it. It wasn't his responsibility. It was that of the governors. Then a few weeks later, he's like, "Oh, I'm the one who gets to make the decisions." There's no consistency here.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna close out, but I'm a sucker for political arguments, and I gotta take the bait before I close. I've been accused of being partisan, and I'm just gonna reject that right now. And I'm going to say this real quickly. I love you, Ricardo. I love my other people in here who are in the Trump power. So I put Trump power in there. Let me say this very clearly. Connie, you might want to close your ears on this one because you're going to hear some stuff about me that you're not going to want to hear. I can't be partisan because I voted for Mike Huckabee. I can't be partisan because I have spoken at the Black Republican Convention years ago. I can't be partisan because I have supported school choice. I have supported all kinds of Republican issues. I can't be partisan because I was supportive potentially of Jeb Bush when he was running. But this guy, and I would reject this as hard as I can, this man is responsible for thousands of people dying. He is responsible for exacerbating racial hatred and division in this country. And I will not sit on the sidelines and give you some pantsy, both sides do it. I will not. I love you guys. I appreciate you. But calling right and wrong, I think is moral and right. And Trump is dead wrong. Not all Republicans are, but he is. And if that makes me partisan, so be it. Would you like to say anything else, Connie, before we close out? All right.
Thank you, Ted.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching. I tell you, we're in some tough times here. I do believe that we can be better. but I do believe that we have to hold our leadership accountable. And I'm hopeful about the future, guys. I really, really am. And I hope that you are as well. Thank you for watching. Let's continue, as Connie said, to be educated, because that is really, I think, where the power is. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.